All right, welcome back, everybody. If I could have you take your seats, please. Before we get started, just a quick admin comment. If this is your first time joining us for a panel, well, first off, if it's your first time joining us, you've missed some really good panels and speakers already in the first 2 days. But just in case it is, each of you should have in front of you right now a pad and a pen. And once we get through introducing the various panelists, I'll start circling. Some of the other ushers will start circling. And just make eye contact with us. Write down your question on a piece of paper. We'll collect them. I'll bring them up to the panel here. And then when they get in the question and answer session, they'll start answering your questions. So, without any further ado, it is my privilege to introduce Cadet 4th Class Colin Seymour to introduce our panel this morning.
Good morning. I'm Cadet 4th Class Colin Seymour, and today I have the distinct honor of introducing Major General Retired Suzanne Vautrinot. Major General Suzanne Vautrinot has many years of experience in the cyber and business realm. She served 3 decades in the Air Force space and cyber operations. She led the 24th Air Force and Cyber Command, where she oversaw multi-billion-dollar cyber enterprises. She has also served as the Deputy Commander of Network Warfare Command, where she played a key role in the beginning of the U.S. Cyber Command. Outside the Air Force, she serves on multiple boards of directors for companies such as Wells Fargo, Ecolab Incorporated, CSX Corporation, Parsons Corporation, and the Battelle Memorial Institute. She received her bachelor's in science degree from the United States Air Force Academy and continued her education to get a master's degree in science from the University of Southern California. In addition, she has also graduated from the Air Command and Staff College, as well as the Air War College, and most recently has become a Harvard Fellow. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, may I have the honor of introducing Major General Retired Suzanne Vautrinot.
What he really means, ladies and gentlemen, is she's back. So if you didn't catch the Cadet 4th class, that means that Cadet Seymour is a underclassman or a freshman at the United States Air Force Academy, and in 35 days, he's going to be an upperclassman when he gets recognized. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Okay, we're gonna try to be a little agile. This is all about agility in operations. That's not a buzzword. And you've been hearing for the last couple of days about what we should be doing, what the threats are, what is necessary from the operators. And ladies and gentlemen, I have the privilege of introducing you to the folks that are actually doing it right now today. So I'm going to start with Gary McCallum, who spent a career in the Air Force, retired as a colonel, and then went off to take experiences that he had learned there as cyber was just being recognized as something that was both a threat to us and our ability to do national security, and an opportunity in terms of how you could leverage it. So he is now the Chief Security Officer for USAA. So for those of you that are members of USAA, you are safe and secure not just in the IT environment and the cybersecurity environment, which he owns, also the physical security environment, all of the financial fraud, prevention and recovery, and business continuity. So all that resilient stuff, Gary is the guy that is doing that. And he comes from us from an information technology career. And just so that you know, he was a graduate of the Citadel. I'm really feeling bad for him in mathematics, but got his master's in Management Information Systems at the University of Arizona, and also a master's from the National Defense University. Much more recently, he has been one of the attendees as well as one of the instructors at the FBI Cyber Academy, the CISO Academy, and is currently the chairman of Internet Security Alliance Board, which is one that built the document that tells all the boards of directors and great big folks in senior management at companies how to think about cyber and how to think about leveraging cyber and its security. Juxtaposed with somebody that came from the military and is now helping in the private sector, we have someone that was extraordinary in the private sector and is now stepping across. And if you were wondering who is the Chief Information or the Chief Transformation Officer for the Department of the Air Force, that would be Lauren Knossenberger. Lauren started in major defense company and helping the intel community, and went on to be the angel investor for any number of firms that have now been successful. So she does innovation now across the Department of Defense and is doing the speed adaptation and emerging technologies and creating a different way, a stronger partnership between DoD, startups, and the venture community. And no one is better than that than somebody that has had their MBA from Wharton School of Business. And she's also received the Jimmy Doolittle Fellowship Award for Inspiring Air Force Innovation and was included in FedScoop's 2018 Top Women in Technology. She'll also tell you she's a fan of Kessel Run and one of its greatest supporters. And we have the Chief Technology Officer for Kessel Run right here today. So Erin, on the far end, Erin Peterson is the Chief Technology Officer for Kessel Run, and she has more than 20 years of experience. So this is somebody that graduated at University of Washington, so that's why you understand why she would have been senior at both Microsoft and Amazon. She's equal opportunity in anyone that can innovate and do great things for the consumer. And now she's doing that with us. If you're not familiar with Kessel Run, we're not talking about Star Wars and how fast you can do it. We're talking about how fast you can do operations and get something into the hands of the warfighter. So you can ask her for things like, how do you do true lean product development? How do you do extreme programming? And what is user-centered design? She's been able to bring all of that in and is getting us solutions in a timely fashion. Erin's complete background is leading in all of those scale corporations, great big ones, so including AOL, Time Incorporated. I already talked about Amazon and Microsoft, and also doing enterprise software solutions. Erin, thank you for being here as well. And last but certainly not least, still in uniform, Bill Wainick. Some of you know him from 1st Combat Comm and 5th Combat Comm. And that's the time that we took not only combat operations, but cyber operations into Combat Comm. That is Bill Wainick. This is a man who has served not only here, but in wartime, not 1, but 2 Bronze Stars. And now he brings that education. And if you remember, Gary was master's degree at University of Arizona, bachelor's at University of Arizona, and then his master's degree in information systems. He is now bringing that to what we have as the apex right up north at the academy, CyberWorks, and the ability to bring that partnership from academic side with our civil side and our private sector right into government and making differences right now today. So when you talk about operations, it's all about making a difference, and that's lessons learned. And I had a mentor that once told me, never tell a story without making a point, never make a point without telling a story. Lauren, you have been through this where even what seems like the simplest innovation, the simplest thing to make operational that is digital is actually tougher than we thought. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I think everyone in this room is probably qualified to tell us about that. I'll start by saying to you that I love the format up here. I'm used to us being behind tables. I'm not sure why we did that to you, but it is fun to look out like I'm watching my own panel, see a number of experts in the room here. But yes, I mean, we do have a lot of roadblocks that we do have to get through to deliver capability. And Kessel Run was actually a really great case study for how you start with a really compelling problem, and everyone is so laser focused on solving that problem that you get through a lot of the barriers. Now, it wasn't easy. It's still not easy. And Erin is still pushing through a lot of things there. But I do want to share with you, actually, Kessel Run, the name wasn't even about going fast. Kessel Run was the smuggling route in Star Wars.
Spice.
And what did you say now?
Spice smuggling.
Yes. Well, I'm sure they smuggled all sorts of
geeks, we
things,
know
but in this case, we were smuggling agile software development into the Air Force because, you know, the joke was that was the only way that we were going to actually be able to adopt agile practices.
Fascinating.
And I mean, the story's been shared far and wide, but I think that there are always folks that haven't heard it. It started out with a Defense Innovation Board trip out to Qatar. And Eric Schmidt's out there, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they're saying, hey, Commander, what keeps you up at night? And it's just like, there's lots of stuff we're doing. We're running, wars in multiple areas, but the biggest thing is just no one can erase my whiteboard. And, so these guys are, of course, very curious about this. But it comes down to, we were doing air ops on a whiteboard. And Eric Schmidt said quite astutely, shouldn't there be an algorithm for that? And so Kessel Run has successfully delivered that algorithm and iterated over time. And we're saving $500,000 a week in fuel at this point. And I want to say $500 million in aircraft maintenance a year. When we get to Erin, I'm sure she has so many more awesome successes. But I'll share too that Kessel Run pioneered those areas of just really strong focus on the problem, strong focus on the customer, user-centered design, showed us for the first time that the DoD really could do this at scale, and that we could push through all of these barriers, and that we could find those senior champions, and that Congress would get excited about the message, and senior leaders would get excited about the message.
Excited in a good way.
Excited in a good way, absolutely. And so it's a great story. We also learned that branding matters, because everyone wants to work for something that's called Kessel Run. Space Camp and Kobayashi Maru have followed along those lines as well. But the next level of maturity, and I think this is probably a good handover to Erin, is once we figured out that we needed to be intensely focused on the customer, we then figured out that our developers had to do a lot of other stuff. A vast majority of their day was not focused on the customer. It was focused on, hey, can I get my build to work? Do I have the tools? Let me go through a bunch of pieces to get to production. And we can chat more about cybersecurity later, but I think that at this point, we've kind of moved on from, the developers have to be intensely focused on the customer, but we have to invest in being intensely focused on making sure that the developers can be productive so that closer to 100% of their time can be focused on delivering that capability to the customer.
So user-centered design and a customer focus with that extreme programming that brings something to bear. Erin, tell us about what it takes to make that happen in an environment that is a little more structured and serial.
So one of the things that's interesting, one of our early lessons on Kessel Run was to think about user-centered design from the perspective of the end user. And I think that 2 additional layers of innovation have come for us from thinking about the developers themselves as users. The developers, the people who have to build things, are also users. And as Bill and I were talking about upstairs, the operators. The operators are an incredibly important set of users for us. If you're going to be replacing those whiteboards, for example, with digital applications, you need to make sure that those digital applications are running all the time. And that means that your operators become really important users of the system to keep those applications running. It means that the leaders out at an AOC who are used to knowing the state of every single element that they have to worry about on a day-to-day basis then have to know that not only for the applications, but they have to know that for the services supporting the applications, and they have to know that for the architecture. One of the things that's been really interesting about being here over the last couple of days is the organic attention that people have been paying to how architecture reflects operations and how a bad architecture will facilitate operations, and a good architecture will facilitate operations, and a bad architecture will kneecap operations. And I think that a lot of people in this room understand that in a very organic way, and we've been bringing that user perspective into the architecture. So one of the things that we're able to do now, for example, is look at a dashboard. One of the best applications we've built is actually not necessarily an end user application, but it's for the operators and it's for the leaders at the AOCs. And it shows the state of every single application that's been deployed out to that AOC. And I'm seeing this crop up in other teams as well. So I don't know if anybody has seen that there's this great tool that's coming out of the BES team, the Bestman team down in Alabama. And that tool lets you see the performance of every single service that every single application is reliant on, and it lets you see the downstream impacts to any service or any physical region if a specific service goes out, which is great, because that's another place where, as an Air Force, as an organization, we're starting to think about the operators and the developers as users on equal footing with those end users who are consuming the applications themselves. And it's an incredibly important discipline, and it's a level of sophistication that as an Air Force we're starting to bring to how we think about the architecture and how we think about networks and how we think about resilience. And that's really, I think, what's going to carry us all forward.
Aaron, as you get those great capabilities into the hands of the operators, they're then able to use them. But Bill, I think that you've had some of the other side where the operator thinks they know what they want, may even want to tell you exactly what they want, but it's not what they really need, and it's not representative of the realm of the possible. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I've actually been guilty of that myself, but when we got to Air Force CyberWorks a few months ago, I became a zealot when it comes to human-centered design and the purposes behind it. It goes back to the operator and the user. Throughout my career, I think I prefer to work on challenges and problem areas that the operators actually come to us for, and they throw down a case of beer saying that you can't do this. But that's the best motivation for us, not the beer, but that we're actually solving problems for the Air Force.
The beer's nice.
The beer is nice, but so we have the operators involved right from the get-go. If we went the other way around, if we went for the technology first, or if we went for the capability first, before understanding the problem, we have a higher risk of actually solving the wrong problem, or we give the operator something to use, and they don't use it because it's not intuitive enough. So we definitely want to start with the operator first, because operators come in, they tell us, hey, this is our problem. Or, I'm sorry, this is our requirement. That's the worst part. This is our requirement, and we want to use this software application, to help solve this problem. One of the hardest parts that we have is
How many people knew that requirement was a four-letter word? Keep going.
Right. So I mean, they come to us with that in mind already, and so one of the things we have to do is convince them. If we had that Men in Black thing where you erase their mind, we would absolutely love it. So come in there, just a clean slate. You don't know anything. You just want to discuss the problem. Discuss the problem. Develop the personas that you're developing for, and develop see what's most viable, and then go after something, and ideally develop something, a wireframe or an MVP right away, so the user gets what they want. But yes, we've had several times where we've had to convince people, and some people it's harder to convince than others. But the thing is, you got to start with the problem first before the requirement, so that you can actually make sure that you're solving for the right problem. But we're, like I said, we're zealots on human-centered design, user experience, prototypes, and MVPs. And we don't believe it's just for the software developers. It's very critical for the software developers, but I think all of us. Even if they're not in a technical discipline, we should all learn this human-centered design methodologies, so that we can actually do better decision-making, make sure we're solving the right problems.
Gary, when I was still wearing a uniform, I would bring all of the leadership from the 24th Air Force over to your innovation center at USAA to teach them how to think about a really great capability. So I know that when you've got exactly the right thing, and now you're trying to put it into fielding. And yet you're working in an area now that probably has more regulation than the United States Air Force. So tell us a little bit about the challenge of having the right thing, but being able to implement it operationally.
Yes, so I work in the financial services sector, and it is highly regulated, and only getting more so. So interesting, I'm both an operator, so I consume technology. I'm also a person who has requirements for people to deliver it. But if we just focus on the security part of it and what we have to deliver both within the enterprise, in our IT environment, and then even the member-facing stuff, anything that we tried to do today, in the past we could do it relatively fast if we had to, and the term pilot a capability versus deploy a system. Pilot, you can do a lot of things very fast. That gets you the fast pass through a lot of wickets that you would normally have to run through. So I love the idea of piloting because it sounds temporary, but if it's really good, you can figure out how to permitize it over time. But in today's regulatory environment, which I think is a real impediment to agility and operations, there is a lot of wickets that you have to go through, and I'll give you a great example. So in the regulatory space, managing models, right? They call it model risk management. Anything that requires a model in the background, in an algorithm, in a capability, has to go through a documentation process and an extensive review process, And it's a very long process, but the regulation defines that as models that could cause serious financial harm to the institution. And for good reasons, all your credit risk, your liquidity ratio models, all of those things fall into that category. But unfortunately, there's been an interpretation of those regulations that anything to do with cybersecurity now could fall into that realm. And so all of the capabilities that we're using and many companies are using have embedded models, right? Behavioral-based models, et cetera. And so now what I find is, now that we have our second line compliance partners coming in, and that is now the regulatory interpretation, everything that we've deployed and are thinking about deploying, we have to go through an extensive, very rigorous process, documentation review, multiple cycles before we can deploy it. Now, if we want to deploy something quickly, we could get a limited use waiver, but that only buys you 90 days to go back and do this extensive amount of work. So what has happened is it's actually become a disincentive now to go out and look for more cutting edge products and capabilities, because the people that have to then go through this process are burdened and overwhelmed by the magnitude of effort. So what we're finding now is regulatory compliance slows the train down quite a bit, which actually creates more risk in the long run in cyber than it actually helps, right? Because what you're mitigating with the model risk management process is somebody's come and look at it, they understand the underlying analytical algorithms, all of those things have been considered by outside experts, and then it's safe to use.
Yeah, and
but
trying to make it perfect like that is
Yeah.
the enemy of good enough. Lauren, talk about how you get past that in terms of both, as an angel investor, you knew what to look for in terms of what was going to be transformational, but also how do you get past certain elements and get it into operations and kind of experiment forward? Sure,
So first, I think everybody in the room, what you just said completely resonates, because we live in that world every day. So I'm sorry that you're having to deal with that now that you left the Department of Defense.
It caught up.
Still got you.
You never thought it'd be better to work in the Department of Defense. There you go.
But now, do the guys where you work, do they say, hey, I wish I had AFNet?
No.
Okay, all right. Well, you got us on that one.
No.
So of course, it's completely different ends of the spectrum. As an angel investor, you're much more looking at the potential of something and the team. And you're not really worried yet necessarily about the cybersecurity implications. You want to know that it's going to work, that there's a market there. And the good news is we're looking at things like that in the Air Force too. Kessel Run, completely started as an angel investment. Let's put a little bit of money into this problem. Let's see if this actually works. Let's see if someone uses it. Can it derive benefit? Does it have to be secure? Absolutely. But first, you do have to make sure that it's going to meet the need before you continue to invest there. But with Kessel Run, actually, the guys got to the point where they had delivered this incredible capability. They could deliver multiple times a day, but we still had them in this gated process where, hey, we could deliver 5 times a day, but then it takes 6 months to approve. And we had a team that actually worked with them incredibly diligently to get down to probably 4 or 5 weeks to approve their well, I'll say capabilities, mix of applications and other we classify things strangely in the Air Force. But when they got to that point, yeah, imagine that, right? Everyone knows this too. But when we got to that point, we realized that we can no longer look at every widget that comes out of the factory. We have to certify the factory itself. We have to certify the process by which things are made. And that's when we got really fast, because that completely brings in the premise of what DevSecOps is, where the security is involved throughout the entire process, where you have fewer manual touch points, where you're automating everything to the highest degree possible, including the security. And by the time everything comes out the end of your pipeline, it should be pretty well ready to go, using the best-in-class tools that probably you're used to using at USAA. And then we still took it a step further, because we knew that we were learning, and we invited a trusted team of hackers who had won a couple of the challenges at DEF CON a few times and also hacked around CIA and NSA to say, come on in, hack away, let's learn. And every time they came in to do a test, they found something new. We shared it with the developers. Not only did they make fixes to what they found, but the developers adjusted their practices. And we're going to continue to find things that way. Nobody's going to be perfect. But as long as everyone's continuing to bring that speed to the way that we deploy, then we're in a really good place. And so I think the way that we've tried to shift the paradigm, I mentioned the certified process over product, but we've tried to put policy behind it too. But even with policy, we do have cultural things in the way, or just trying to find new ways of doing business when people are trying really hard. So we put out Fast Track ATO. I had been in the Air Force maybe a year when we did that, and and I thought the response would be, yes, we can come up with what makes sense for all of these different areas. And we did get that quite a bit. Some people were so thrilled. Yes, I'm so glad that we're finally bringing hackers in to tell us how secure we are, because that's actually proof. It's not a checklist where things are equally important. But we also had quite a large cadre of people that said, well, but where's the checklist for Fast Track ATO? And after I face-palmed a few times, we realized that actually we did need to give them a little bit more detail, because we had had decades of giving people prescriptive answers. And so now we have a couple of paths. We say, these are the most important controls that we want you to look at. We'd much rather have you just talk to us in narrative form about how you were doing things like threat detection, continuous monitoring, what is your ICAM strategy? But if you want to go through the controls, if it's easier for your team, do it. Because it's all about making it easier, more transparent to get to that same trusted result.
So some of our youngest folks are always the ones that know what the barriers are. So for Tech Sergeant Kiyoshi, thank you for the question. What he's talking about is the barrier that comes from organizational structure. And so specifically, how will agile operations account for current kind of wicked C2 problems? For example, things like operational control, OPCON and DERLOF, and how that works through the system, how you get your intelligence support into the system, into the network, and the variety of problems among the different forces and leadership. So this is about structure of organizations and how do you overcome some of those things. And Bill, I know you've had to do that in the development side of the community, but also the operational. You want to start, and then we'll give everybody a chance. It's a great question.
It is a great question, and there's probably not a great answer, but I mean, there could be, and will be, but as far as organizational change and management and everything else like that, I come from the cloth where it's supposed to be flat communications, and the less the Napoleonic hierarchy. I know we had to do that for certain units, and sometimes you're as much as you want to make some organizational changes, it's just you're banging your head against the wall trying to do that. But to be honest with you, I mean, it starts with the leadership at the top to be able to drive that organizational change. Having top cover is critical to be able to make that change, so that you get the get out of jail free cards for when you're trying to do something. But we at Air Force CyberWorks, anyways, we're trying to be a multidisciplinary team. We're small. We have 9 government individuals, 4 contractors, and we can't afford to have specialists. And so we need to make sure that we're spreading the wealth and spreading the talent, and everybody can cover for each other. And it's kind of what we've done similar with previous organizations in the special operations, anyways, where you couldn't just be a specialist. You had to be a jack of all trades, a Swiss Army knife, whatever you want to call it. And so I think if you're going to try to make change within your organization, you have to show the merits, you have to show the whys, you have to identify the problem, of why the organizational structure right now is making you less effective. We can help with that, help you identify the problems, and then you basically sell that to your leadership and say, hey, this is the problem because we have this Napoleonic hierarchy where the people with the great ideas, they have to go through 7 layers just to be able to present their idea to the decision maker. So identify the problem, approach it to the leadership, and make suggestions. Don't have the leadership try to figure it out for you, but also make sure that they understand maybe it's an experiment. That you don't have to do things in concrete right away. That you can actually say, hey, let's just give this a try. Let's work on a few projects, few issues, and let's see how it goes. Maybe that's the right way to start off with the grassroots, but you really got to get the leadership involved right from the get-go as well. So
I'll share the way that I diplomatically put this back at the Pentagon is that we are immensely successful given how we are organized. no organization on the planet could be as effective as we are, given the way we are organized. But I mean, and really what comes down to it is we don't often align authority, competency, and responsibility for execution in the same place. And it's incredibly hard to be successful when you don't do those things. They're the fundamental building blocks of business. But something that I am seeing us do better and better is we are able to come together and have an intense focus on a problem, just like in the commercial world. And when that happens, teams do naturally self-form to solve different parts of that problem. And so while I don't think that I'm going to see the major organizational changes that would make this all easier for us, during the next few years, I am seeing us be very effective with cross-functional teams. And I am seeing us have some really wonderful collaboration across the different parts of the organization to drive toward those. I still think that we can do that better, and we need to do that better. But that is the kind of the trend that I'm seeing.
Right. And Aaron, you talked about building a big bench or building a better bench that is able to articulate. And sometimes if you can explain, you can actually get the message through. While Aaron is talking about that, we do have the handheld mics, but if you want to write down a question and pass it on to Rich, we're happy to answer it up here. And we'll go to the handheld mics after Aaron tells us a little bit about the bench.
Sure. So we were talking a bit about the bench upstairs, and we're also talking a bit about this topic as well, about how as a junior person you drive the sort of change in an organization this large. In a bench, what you do, particularly in industry, because software projects take so long to execute, you're talking 5, 10, 15 years, you're constantly looking at who is that set of leaders on the bench that I can work with to get things done. And if you're on that bench as a leader, it's a lot easier to get things done. I think a very interesting question was just raised about when you are in an organization that is as big as this organization and you see a problem that needs to get solved, how do you solve that problem when you don't yet have that leverage that comes to you as being a leader in an organization? And one of the things that I think is hard to understand when you're relatively junior in a career is that when you're in an organization this big, you're not the only one with that problem. When you're a leader, you can look around and you know who the 100 people are, or the 500 people are who have the same problem. But if you go out and you look for the other people who are trying to solve the same problem that you're trying to solve, that's a natural cohort against which you can start to build collaboration. And the more people you have involved in solving these problems, the better off you are. The more people that you can collaborate with, the easier it's going to be to drive change across an organization. And one of the things for us to think about now with the digital problems that we're trying to solve, we've seen some great presentations about this the last few days, is the scale and the scope of the complexity of the problems that we're trying to solve right now in cyber demand a level of collaboration and cross-org coordination of action that I think is unlike what we've expected to show as we've solved what were purely IT problems in the past. And so figuring out how to do that collaboration in a way that isn't about being touchy-feely, but it's about genuinely identifying that cohort of people who are trying to solve the same problem and bringing to bear resources and imagination and focus in solving them is what's going to be required for us to be successful in meeting the adversarial threat that's in front of us today.
Excellent. So this is the bake it in versus bolt it on question, and we thank you for it. We heard all week that cyber and cybersecurity needs to be brought into the SDLC earlier. So in your opinions, at what point or points in the process should information assurance be introduced and considered? So, Bill, you want to start?
Sure, I would love to, actually. I have a concern that we're putting too much emphasis on security and we're not practicing what I would call extreme agile, maybe enough. I'm concerned that if we get into a near peer war, if we get into a World War III or whatever it is, World War II, how many airplanes, ships, tanks, trucks, weapons were developed during that 4-year time frame for the U.S. anyways. And I'm concerned that as far as the cybersecurity piece, that we're going to get out of practice with developing something so rapidly that we get it into the hands of the warfighter quickly. And it's not just with the software, but it's with systems and weapons and whatnot. So I am concerned about that, that I think we're getting out of practice with the, with rapid development because of cybersecurity. Now, do I care about cybersecurity? Yes, I do. I want to make sure that we're, that we're assuring the data and the voice or whatever is getting to where it needs to go. But, when we should continue to do what we're doing as far as baking the security piece in, but I really do think that we should have the ability to go rapid without having to worry about ATOs and everything else like that to keep in practice for just in case of an emergency.
Gary, you've got both sides of the problem. You've got the built-in security as you're developing, but you've also got the business resiliency and continuity, so you can address it from both sides. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'll just build a little bit on what Bill said. I would love for us, when we're working with the lines of business to deploy a product or a capability, I would love us to be involved very early on in the process, because what happens, we'll get to a point of deployment and there'll be a lot of things that will not have been done from a risk assessment perspective and a controlled environment perspective around whatever that capability is. The challenge is we have people that are very dogmatic, and that creates some slowness and lack of agility in the system. And so the challenge from a security side is to be a partner with the line of business early on and figure out how to do something versus to say, no, we can't do that, right? To be more of an enabler versus an impediment. And that is a culture shift. And so what I've discovered over time in my particular organization, USAA, the security team is a peer organization of IT, which is a different organizational construct. So we have a partnership and we're embedded with them, but what we have seen, and it's not unlike you see in the military or in other industries, when security is not on, when they're not involved early or they become an impediment in the process, people will go around. And when that happens and capabilities get deployed, a lot more risk to the organization ends up being the result. And I'll tell you right now, our war story, we have been moving as a company more and more to public cloud over the last few years. And the IT model around governance and the security model around how to do that safely was not in place. And if it was in place to the degree it needed to be, it wasn't very agile. It was very bureaucratic. And so in some cases, we had lines of business bypassing that and going out into using corporate cards or invoicing capabilities and deploying a pilot capability, right, for good reason, good business requirement, because they couldn't figure out how to get through the wickets. And imagine that, right? Deploying a capability into public cloud that has all sorts of implications from how you're protecting intellectual property and information. And so we had to figure out how to speed up our process and make it more user-friendly and help people get through it versus make them have to walk through coals, right, to get to a capability. So early on, yes, but definitely having an agile mindset and figuring out how to help the customer versus slow them down is critical.
I think we could probably talk about this one all day.
Yeah.
But I will say, and I think I'm the only authorizing official up here, that even as an authorizing official who sits right next to our CISO, I will say that there are a lot of times that innovation just needs to win. When we are doing something that we have never done before, we have to know that it's going to work. We need to push things forward. Now, in wartime, you could do the most amazing thing. If it's not secure, hacker can take it out of the sky, can steal all of the critical intel that we just gathered, change our command and control. So it's immensely important, but we do have to have that room to be creative, absolutely. But there is less of a trade-off now between security and innovation than there ever has been before. And that's something I don't think people fully appreciate, especially in the software realm, that, just bringing in functional programming concepts, having hackers who, by the way, the best hackers in the world are developers, involved from the first time you sit down and start thinking about the architecture of your system to just be like, hey, I can tell you before you even, build this thing, I can take you out here, here, and here. Hey, I would architect it this way. And then you're moving. The whole point is that you have that expertise in the room with you. You're doing tabletops throughout the process. You're not actually slowing down your development process. You're just doing it thoughtfully. And this is something that Aaron and I talk about a lot too, is that we re-innovate in a lot of ways that have already been done. Mm-hmm. And we kind of feel the need to kind of fly off and rebuild things that have already been done very securely. But if we can find that community and work together and learn from what other people have already built securely, then you can take that next that next leap in innovation, because all of that foundation has already been secured below you. And I want to give Erin a chance too.
Yeah, there are two things that come to mind. One is that we continue to think of somehow we either are secure or move fast. And there are places, Etsy's a great example. There are places now where people ship, the very first day they get there, they're shipping features, they're shipping services into production with actual users. And they're able to do that because there's all sorts of frameworks and guardrails built into the technology, top to bottom, so that you can show up on the first day and every executive knows you don't have to know the developer, you don't have to view their code, but you know that you're safe letting any developer who's passed that hiring pipeline walk in the first day and ship code to prod, and they're not going to break anything. And it is really important that we figure out how to build those frameworks in place to let people deliver rapidly and securely and with resilience. And one of the things that I think about that was driven home to me by meeting with a set of operators here is that we run our software in 3 states, right? We run our software in a contested state, we run our software in a denied state, we run our software in a permissive state. And frankly, most of the time, we think we're running our software in a permissive state. We're actually running our software in a contested state. We're just not always aware of this. And going back to Bill said about the World War III example, the very day that we're most going to need to have our applications work, the very day that we're most going to need to have people be able to deliver rapidly and with resilience is a day that we are almost certainly going to be operating in a denied state or a contested state. And if we know that now, then it's incumbent upon us to put in place the sort of frameworks and vehicles that allow for rapid software development and rapid distribution of those fixes and new features and technology. And we have the time to do that now. We won't have the time to do that then.
And this is our top priority that we are working on together right now.
And just in the way the question was asked, I had a conversation with General Wegeman yesterday, and this kind of thing came up. And I've noticed that even at the university level, so for example, Cal State San Luis Obispo doesn't separate these things. They make cybersecurity part of the curriculum. So if you are doing industrial architecture and that design, part of your curriculum is cybersecurity. So it's actually baked into the design and the way that you think about doing development. And that's happening in our universities, and I think it's starting to happen in the way that you all are doing the development and the operation. So it doesn't have to be either or, and it doesn't have to be an outside expert. It's actually integrated. Now we've got a question that says, as we continue to move toward DevSecOps, I know that's a bad word for you guys, but we'll say it anyway.
It's a great word.
Towards that
I like
model, the change in the relationship between acquisition and operations, and what are the key challenges that need to be addressed? And do we kind of think about starting to protect our software factories as operational assets with that same level of protection and defense in cyberspace?
So a software factory produces software that is resilient and secure only insofar as every aspect of that software factory is resilient and secure. And when we're operating in a world where you have a CATO, continuous ATO, I think when the continuous ATO first came out, people are like, this is great. We're going to be able to ship many times a day, and we're going to get an ETO every time. And now people are doing it long enough that they're realizing, oh, this means that somebody is going to be giving me a spectacle every single time and taking a look and making sure that my practices are resilient and reliable and that every aspect of what I'm doing is resilient and reliable. It has to be built in from day one. It's a matter of everyone understanding that they are an important part of a system that leads to the production and operation and distribution of resilient, reliable software.
Yeah, now our big thing that we talk about is we kind of joke about the Russians and the surveillance van test. Can someone pull up outside of a software factory, gain access, and push code into production?
Right.
And so, goal number one is for that not to happen. We joke that, you can't get parking in Boston anyway, so that's our first line of defense. It'd be very hard to park your van to, long enough to hack
Simple
something.
solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can't get there anyway.
Yes, but that is kind of the big why. We need to make sure that code is not intentionally or unintentionally pushed into production.
Great. And Bill, you've been working with Hill Air Force Base and some of the other folks in terms of how they think about design. Are they thinking about the security at that level, at that forefront, or is that something that's going to need to come?
Yeah, I really can't speak for Hill. I know that they are the software maintenance group that we've been talking to quite a bit about forming a more formal relationship. That's still in progress, but their group is all on board with the DevSecOps and with the Platform One and all the platforms that I think Nick Shalon has said, omnibus, omnibus, you are now a DevSecOps platform certified. And so they're on board with that. Our intent is when we start developing MVPs, prototypes, and whatnot from our wireframes is to absolutely use one of the platforms that the Air Force has already put out there. Just because it makes complete sense just because it's already certified, it's already ATO'd, KTO'd, whatever it's called. So absolutely we're all on board with that.
Great. Anything else? Any other barriers, concerns?
Well, I'll add something on this one because, again, we have a very large in-house IT development operation to include some offshore augmentation of that. And so speed to market is really, really important in our world. But at the same time, that regulatory requirement to make sure that you're producing, secure code as much as possible. What we've learned and what I think we all intuitively know is you can do a lot of testing. We do all the right testing, right? So we do static code testing, dynamic code testing. We run a penetration test using an outside party, let's say on our mobile application, and then it's deployed, right? But that, in our mind, that is a pretty good level of due diligence, right? But nobody will ever say we're 100% guaranteed that there's not a bug. And so we were able to, it's been 4 years since I was able to walk through a 2-year approval process through legal I think we were the first financial services company to implement a responsible disclosure or bug bounty program. And so for 4 years, we've had that in place. And I would say off the top of my head, we've probably over 4 years had probably 60 or 70, disclosures or reports. Out of that, a handful were validated. And I would say 3 in 4 years were what I consider to be critical vulnerabilities, right? In either our web application facing software or our mobile app. Brilliant. Right? Fantastic. $3,000 well spent, right, in those cases. But at each case, we went back and said, well, what was the testing pipeline? How did it get out there? And in every case, there are configurations and scenarios that the tools that we use for testing they can't find, right? And the user acceptance testing won't necessarily exercise that. And so
we call it the wild.
You can never guarantee, right, that ecosystem of testing is going to find every possible scenario.
And that's, I think, where the rapid response becomes really important, right? You're not going to find them all on the front end of the pipeline, but you need to be able to fix them quickly when they're found on the back end of the pipeline, right?
It's a great point.
And that is a key premise that we employ as well. It's not just about finding the bugs, it's finding out how they got through and continuing to tailor that pipeline so that you have increased confidence.
Yep.
We're also trying to incorporate more chaos engineering principles as well, especially at Kessel Run. Hey, what happens if I unplug this server,
Yeah, I think we all got to see a great example this week of a software failure, right? And I think that what we often talk about security, but we forget that security is a class of issues that fall within resilience. And what you're doing is you're building for resilience. And oftentimes, when you have a security issue, it's not even clear when it's going on whether it is a security issue or whether somebody messed something up. And if we look back at what happened in Iowa this week, for 24 hours, it wasn't clear necessarily what exactly happened. But it also didn't matter, right? It didn't matter if it was a hacker, and if it didn't matter if it was incompetence, the impact was the same. And when you're building for a level of resilience and you're catching those issues that you caught in prod and you're changing your testing system and you're catching things like configurations so you can automate it, you're constantly making that system more resilient. And that's perhaps as important as security, if not more so, than building for security.
So this is a money question. Innovation is sometimes expensive. I know that comes as a shock to everyone, at least at the outset. So how can a unit pursue funding to support innovation or exploring new technologies? And since you all are building the capability to do exactly that, I'm guessing whoever asked this question needs to meet you so that they can get some of what you've got. But talk about how do you do that and how do you work the...
So, it depends on what kind of innovation we're talking about. We overuse that word, unfortunately. But I mean, if you're looking at something that's local that you can test for cheap, we do have the Squadron Innovation Funds. We do have a couple of different programs where you can put an idea forward. You can get corporate sponsorship. We have Spark Tank coming up at the end of the month.
Yeah,
as
talk
well.
about
I'm
Spark
excited about
Tank
that.
as well, because
Okay, sure.
Shark Tank only nicer, but go ahead.
Okay. But sometimes, honestly, it comes down to just making trade-off decisions and building a business case behind what you want to do and finding a way to do it in an inexpensive manner first. There are so many places where we could spend $10 million and we could shut down a $100 million system, but we are oftentimes afraid to make that decision, or the right business case hasn't been made, or we haven't proven that the replacement will work. And many people have decades of seeing broken promises and things that don't work. And just really, really high claims that never pan out. And so that's why it's so important that we start out with the business case and we test things first. But then once we do know that something is working, we've put that capital investment down and we're seeing it pay off, that we are willing to pull the plug on other things that do not as well support our mission, or that might be draining other things that we need to focus on.
Great.
But Spark Tank, I think most people know about Spark Tank. Each MAJCOM selects 2 finalists from among usually several hundred ideas across the Air Force. AFWorks and API, we also look at all of the submissions that are put forward. So even if a MAJCOM commander does not pick you, we have kind of a wild card round. Because sometimes, maybe at that level, there's less risk, more of a focus on a functional that's important to the MAJCOM, but it's still an awesome idea. And so we go through, pick a few wild cards, and then those top 6 end up on stage at AFA Orlando at the end of the month. So it's really a pitch competition. Airmen get to pitch directly to the Secretary of the Air Force, the Chief Master Sergeant, and 2 celebrity judges. Last year it was Mark Cuban and George Steinbrenner.
Yeah, great.
And really they get support on the spot. We have folks show up with business cards. We have SPOs show up and say, how can I help you get through this? It's still hard sometimes, even with senior level support, to push those things through with the velocity that we want. Because even, another issue with our innovation initiatives is that, people have a full-time job, and then they get to use, our 20% time is really our 120% time.
Right.
So that's a reality. But one thing that's coming up that I'm really excited about is the Vice Chiefs Challenge. And that is really going to be a situation where we're able to save airmen time and get them more focused on the mission by finding those things that we can automate. And the functionals are actually going to look at where they can help with some of those things. Wow. There was a case, an airman pitched me an idea, hey, if you add these 2 fields in this one system, it'll save me 5,000 man-hours a year in inventory. Sent that over to the logistics guys. I hope we're building it in. But I mean, there are sometimes these little things that give us back all of this time that we can then invest in finding that next thing.
Little change, big difference.
Yeah.
Gary, CRADA is not a new idea like Spark Tank, but it's been very effective because it's a relationship that allows industry and government to work directly together, and it's not about the money, it's about the partnership. Can you talk a little bit about cooperative research and development agreements and how you've been able to leverage those?
Well, thanks to you, when you were wearing the uniform, we were able to sign a CRADA with the 24th Air Force. And for us, what that has allowed is a level of collaboration and information sharing that we couldn't do legally any other way, particularly from the government side of the house. So they have to have a CRADA. So we've hosted many visits, continue to host many visits from a lot of the tactical operator side of the house to share best practices. I believe we've helped them look at some things that we're doing in our operation that can potentially be applied back into the bigger Air Force world, which is much more complicated, much more constrained by lots of regulations. But that information sharing relationship has just made things a lot easier to talk to people.
Yep, and always nice when at least it's free, or at least other people's money. So you have a shout out from the floor that you're diligently addressing cyber issues before going operational. Can you also discuss bake-off integration testing in the real world, and especially for the Air Force? And this is for heat, powerless, taking that effect, and then getting towards the user preference. Does that kind of the bake-off piece? I might not have
Integration testing.
asked that quite
Is that
correctly.
like, is that like comparing different solutions?
Yeah, I think so.
Is that your best interpretation?
That's my interpretation. It can be a great way to drive healthy behavior at bake-off. It lets two teams compete head-to-head, and it lets people establish standards for higher performance. I haven't seen it used frequently yet in the Air Force, but I think if it is, you guys are more familiar with that dynamic internally than I am. I've seen it in industry across, competing teams of thousands of people competing each other.
It's actually
And I think
really,
part of it is also the bake-off of the integration testing. Does it work for the user? So-
Right, yeah, what I was going to say is that's a really interesting question because actually it points out the fact that most of our bake-offs stop short of that. It's usually kind of in a theoretical environment. Does it meet the user need? We don't necessarily stress test it in production.
It's coding in PPT. It's coding in PowerPoint, usually, the bake-offs that I've seen.
Yeah.
So, Zan, can I add a perspective on that? So in corporate America world, we love bake-offs, and we've sort of evolved our way about doing that. In the security technology stack, as we have new requirements that typically about 3 years is how long we'll keep a capability around before we'll go back out to see if there's a better mousetrap. What we've evolved over the years is, sure, we spend time developing what is the requirement, or the set of requirements for the new capability that we want to deploy, and that's how we traditionally did. Then we might bring some vendors into our lab, and we maybe do a limited test. What we started doing, though, is spending a lot of time on the requirements, but then we employ an outside party to do objective testing, right? Sometimes we'll bring them into our environment, we'll turn it over to them. They're kind of co-writing with us on this. But what we want at the end of the day is a third-party objectives, like based on the set of requirements you gave, here's how this capability probably would perform in your environment. And oh, by the way, here's how this capability is performing in the industry vertical also, right? So we get a little bit of comparative shopping at the same time, but we found it to be very useful because what happens, people's relationships sometimes get in the way of objectivity, and so there's personal relationships involved, right, for good reasons with vendors, and just taking that totally out of the equation and being able to point to this, it solves a lot of issues right down the road. But we've found the bake-offs to be really, really useful.
Go ahead.
Zan, I got one more, and it kind of ties in with the funds for the innovation, the question that was asked previously as well. So one of the big challenges we have, I think, across the Air Force, and we have some senior leaders in the room that can hopefully fix it, but duplication of effort. I don't think we could ever get to the bake-off scenario within the government, or maybe we can because we don't have the funds to do that, the resources. We have some instruments and tools out there to help us identify problem areas. I'll give you a specific example where we almost went into a bake-off scenario, but we had no money. So we went into IdeaScale, which is a great platform to hear from the airmen across the Air Force as far as problems. And there was an airman from Seymour Johnson that said, "Hey, I need a flight scheduling application." Cool. They've been using puck boards, the magnets for forever and a day, and they wanted to do something automated. So we put a lot, resources behind that to get after the problem and develop potential solutions and whatnot. One of our designers is showing it off to some folks from Hickam, and the guys from Hickam was like, "Hey, yeah, we're doing a flight scheduling application as well." And it comes to find out that there's multiple people doing flight scheduling applications, but nobody's really corralling who's doing what.
So the most hilarious part of this story to me, and I need to follow up on this, is there are at least 8 that have been rattled off the email. And so I immediately sent a note over to Air Combat Command and said, "Hey, can we do a bake-off on this? I'll ask about if we're going to do bake-off integration testing next time." Thanks for that question. But what I heard was, "Hey, we've done bake-offs in the past." So the next question was, well, why didn't they work? And it turns out it's because we can't agree on what the word sortie means. So that was an eye-opener for me. So I think the communities are now collaborating more between those because we have gotten them connected. But I think, and Aaron talked about this earlier, just across the Air Force, there are other people that have your problem, that are solving your problem, may have already solved your problem. IdeaScale is one way to find people. Collaboration channels are another way to find people. But we need to just really assume that we're not unique and really make a conscious effort. I'll tell you, with the DevSecOps community, I was able to connect software factors at a rate that had never happened before because everyone wanted a continuous ATO. And so everyone was reaching out to me saying, hey, I have this amazing capability. Can you come look at it? And so we all got together in Colorado Springs, actually, last July, and everyone met in person. We climbed a mountain. You know, it was a great meeting up there, too. And after that, there was this flurry of activity across the entire community. And we're starting to do that across other communities. Now, with Navy and Compile to Combat, I happened to be on a panel with Admiral Barrett about 2 years ago. And we're talking about Kessel Run and continuous ATO, and she's talking about Compile to Combat. We're sitting right next to each other. We had never met. That led actually to Kessel Run then trying to run their code developed in PCF onto a Navy ship with their OpenShift implementation. And so I've had a lot of things happen through happenstance, have also made a concerted effort. But I think the more that we are making that concerted effort and also asking even up, like if we can't find them naturally, I mean, all of the colonels to general officers all grew up together too and can reach across the community, but that's critically important.
It's great to see that change in the behavior, and when you change behavior permanently, then it's culture. We have a question that says, at Kessel Run, what differences in organizational culture compared to the more traditional environment across the Air Force have contributed to the successes?
There are two things, I think, that I've observed are distinct about the Kessel Run culture. One is valuing insight over rank. There's a high degree of comfort of challenging anybody in the room on an idea, regardless of their rank, regardless of their contractor, just asking the question and pushing forward. That's been really important. The second thing that's been really important is that it is a team that is, I'm going to say this really carefully, it's a team that is comfortable making mistakes. Because what I observe is that sometimes that is heard as, oh, you get to go out and fail as much as you want. But when we, air quote, make mistakes, it's in a rigorous and disciplined way. We immediately respond and use our agile processes to improve the things that we have discovered that aren't working. We try and catch them in staging. We occasionally catch them in prod. A feature won't work the way that we thought that it would work for operators, or a feature won't work the way that we thought it would work for airmen. And so we spin around very quickly and we acknowledge that, and we fix things and we immediately ship things out into production. And I think a lot of people focus on the speed with which Kessel Run moves, but we use that speed to ship things faster, to realize our mistakes faster, and we combine that with a willingness to hear from anyone in the room who's observing, hey, we could do this thing better than we're doing it, or hey, you made a really bad decision there, which my staff has gotten remarkably comfortable telling me in staff meetings. And we use that to our advantage, and we use that to move forward, I think, in a better way.
Terrific. So, Henry Ford dedicated 30% of his factory to tooling. And Bill, you actually used the word tool, but not in this context. How much effort are you suggesting for tooling, and are you using those kinds of specialists?
30% to tooling, and are we using that specialist?
Yeah, I think the question comes from, are we able to repeat?
I think it's really a question about platform, and I think Erin's our best evangelist here.
Yeah.
So for my team, it's nearly 100%. What we do is we say, hey, if there's something that has to be done more than once, let's go ahead and let's automate it. And we have a strong focus on automation. And sometimes this conflicts with the team that is saying, well, 2 years ago, we started being able to move fast and break things, and now we're putting in place automation. And automation does take more time and effort to put in place up front. It ultimately saves thousands of hours. And so we're constantly making this smart choice. A really good example is that we've put in place automation to be able to do our security assessment of applications, which is great. But sometimes we get a new application with a new service, and we don't yet have the automation in place. Almost always we write the automation, but we had an application come through. It was a legacy application that somebody wanted to stand up on our platform, and the team was starting to go down the path of writing the automation, and in a design review, we realized that it was going to take 16 weeks to write the automation. The app was supposed to be done in 6 weeks, and it was only going to take 2 weeks to do that review manually. And so the team then made the very smart decision, in that case, not to do automation, and instead deploy manual resources to doing the security assessment and review the application, and then run the services that we already had automation for through the pipeline. And I think that that represents a good way for us to think about automation. We should look for automation where it's going to lower the burden or allow us to more securely and safely and more quickly get features and functionality out. But we shouldn't be dogmatic about that and require exclusively, perhaps, the use of automation when that will put the kibosh on innovation or getting things out to the field quickly. Does that make sense, Bill, in your experience in terms of what you're observing with the software factories? I mean, you guys are starting to do pilots, right? You're doing the one-offs, and I think you haven't yet had the opportunity to look and say, is this going to go faster when we try and move these things to production? But can you see a bridge to be able to spin up innovation going into development?
I do if we're given the resources to do it and access to the people with the problems, so that they can actually help develop the solutions. But I completely agree with you on every single point. I mean, the automation is going to be critical so that we can, if there's something that's completely manual that takes 5 people to operate, then we should automate that so we can have them do our priorities instead.
Yeah, and free up that room for innovation, free up those resources for other people to take risks.
Yeah, Gary, you had something to add?
Yeah, I would say two aspects of that. From a corporate America USA perspective, within the cybersecurity space, we have been long fans of the automation. That's the only way to scale in the environment that we're in terms of just the amount of information. The secret to making that work, though, has been having people who really understand those processes and then have the ability to write scripts, right, and work with developers to automate it. And so I'm very happy with where we're at within our operational space. But what I see when I look across USAA, there is a regulatory driver for us to automate many more of our controls than we have automated today. But what we're finding out, no surprise here, no revelation, is automating a bad process doesn't get you anything, right? And so spending the time to go through a process engineering action, right, in order to really understand what you're trying to automate is critical. We are stumbling through that right now across the lines of business. I would much rather have a really robust, well-designed manual control, for example, than a poorly automated one. But what we have started off measuring, and we started off earlier doing this, and we're starting to evolve, is we were just we were measuring how many of the manual controls have been automated, right? But nobody was going back to measure of how many of these things were still good once you automate. Now, if they were bad before, did the control suddenly get better because you automated? And in all cases, the answer is no. So it's been a learning experience in our world, in the business side, to spend more time on the process engineering side before you go into the automation side.
Terrific insights.
Yeah. And I'll just add that, I mean, this is something that is right in the middle of a lot of the things that we're trying to solve right now. A year or two ago, every team, and today still a lot of teams, before they can start coding, they have to build a cloud environment and get it accredited. They have to build a platform and get it accredited. And then sometime long in the future, they can start coding. Some people are still doing that by themselves, and it's a long, tedious process. It is a different skill set to build out a platform than it is to develop an app. And you really have to have your most talented engineers focused on delivering that developer capability at the platform level. So we are trying to build those common services where you can go to a Kessel Run or a Platform Run and basically say, push button, spin up cloud, get platform. I mean, it's not that simple, of course.
No,
but that is what
much more simple than starting over.
But much more simple than starting over on this very long, expensive journey that is riddled with risk. And oftentimes we just don't execute well the first time. And so what we're trying to do more and more is push people to collaborate with those teams. So instead of developing your own development platform, find Kessel Run, find Platform One. If you have talented engineers and there's a service that you have that's not already existing on their platform, which we are defining as a complementary and comprehensive set of services that we orchestrate together to deliver mission value, okay, a comprehensive set. If it doesn't have that service, work with them to deliver that service, not just for you, but for everybody. And so then we have much more of a collaborative situation going on. Those common platforms aren't underutilized because there's a duplication of effort, and all the engineers learn from each other. And we've had a lot of success with that, with both Kessel Run's platform, KRES, and with Platform One. And it's kind of forcing people to collaborate. And so I'm very excited about that piece. I mean, we still have a lot of work to do, but we're learning together.
Yeah, and I think it's what we're starting to see with those teams in particular is a secondary, sort of an afterlife of complexity, if you will. Within the Air Force, things have remained the same for so long that people will make a change and they'll deploy new technology and they're like, great, now we're done, we're stable. But in the world of modern software development, what that means is you've added complexity, you've freed up resources for innovation, which means there's more complexity coming your way. What I often say on our own software teams is success is just as disruptive as failure. There's this thought that somehow you're going to be successful, which means you're going to stabilize things again, when in fact, you're going to be successful and you're going to increase the amount of complexity you're going to take on in the next 6 months after that, which is another good reason to collaborate on those fundamental building blocks and those fundamental services in the platform. Not only do you not want to duplicate resources and build them twice to begin with, you definitely don't want to be maintaining an alternate set of services when you're trying to build the newly complex applications and services that people are going to come to you for after you've demonstrated that you're successful in doing it.
There's one more thing I want to add before we move on, because this is I think this audience can help with this actually. So we talk about DevSecOps, okay? And I think we've done a pretty good job of the DevSec part. And we are able to push between, development and test. Pushing to production is a lot harder. There are so many different owners of production environments, and we have not done a good enough job of bringing in the agile IT operations. And, if we're working with 10 different comm squadrons to deliver to 10 different places, it's just incredibly complicated. So that's really kind of the next area that we have to drum down. We have to have those IT ops people more embedded with us.
Yeah, and we have that capacity. We have that capability. Like a great example of where we've freed up capacity for innovation is with ITAS. So right now we're entering a world where we can do automated deployments of our platform and our applications out into a lot of different physical environments in addition to the cloud. And that doesn't mean that we no longer need people on the ground to pay attention to them. It means we need smart people who understand networks and who understand operations and who understand IT to be able to be on the ground near the endpoints. And being able to work with people in the community around ITAS has been fantastic for us. And this is a resource that we've just started tapping into in the last 2 months. But this has been a fantastic place for us to start to look for co-conspirators and collaborators.
So Alaskan Air Command sits right on the edge of where they have to look the adversary, sometimes in the eye. And so Colonel Maxwell, thank you for the question. He says he's seeing more requirement for the 6 communities, the information technology communities, to work cyber threats and the common operating picture. And since these issues cross between the J2 and the J3 in an organizational structure, how can we better address that kind of issue?
Well, I'll start in saying there's no such thing as a cop.
Nothing's common.
There's no common operational picture out there, but I would say that for bridging the capabilities, I'll give you an example from a previous tour where we had the cop to end all cops. And we didn't start with the problem first, what we were trying to solve. I think we just were trying to fuse data, fuse sensor data, fuse tracks and everything else like that into the cop. From a variety of sources, and we were just trying to make it work. All right, so what happened was it became a kludge of systems, and we had to hire some really brilliant contractors to actually operate the system. Now, with the J2 and the J3, A2, A3, and everything else like that, if you would have started off with the problem first, you could have developed 4 personas. And you would have started, you would have figured out the problem you're trying to solve, and you figure out the persona, what the A2, J2 needs versus what the J3 needs as well. Mm-hmm. So before we should have even started programming, and then in the future, if you do build a COP, that you need to make sure that you know who you're developing for, and then what you're trying to solve with that, because the J2 is going to have a different viewpoint than the J3, than the commander, than the J4, and of course the J6. So I would just encourage that the J6s and the A6s out there that. Please don't get into the, let's go with technology first. Let's go with the, what's right in front of you. Start with the problem.
Mm-hmm. We do like to make 10 different dashboards and common operating pictures. Not so common, rather than realizing that we can have a truly common operating picture or dashboard that has flags that you can flip for different types of things. And really it comes down to, we are trying to get our data house in order as well, and to connect systems that haven't been connected before, and to make sense of data that we have not pulled together into one use case before. So,
Yeah.
I mean, those are all
Actionable
challenges.
information, and how do you communicate it? So let me take the last couple of minutes and give you each 30 seconds. What would be actionable in what you would like the audience to think or do next that would help move us forward?
I'm going to just beat the cross-collaboration drum again. We talked about the challenge of the way that we're organized. We talked about all of the kind of stovepiped efforts that happen because people can't find each other. And so I would just challenge the group, try even harder to find each other. Go up the chain, use idea scale, but find that community of other people that are innovating against the same problems that you are.
Terrific. Gary?
Wow, good one. From a security perspective, I try never to play the thou shalt card, right? You have to do this. In the business world, that is a very unsavory thing to do, and sometimes you have to. But when we're trying to deploy a capability, and we want the business pays the bill, right? A couple of things. One, get the business involved and help them understand how it's going to benefit them. And a great example of what we're doing right now is we're deploying a passive voice biometrics authentication capability within the call centers. And to the business owners that run those call centers, we get 50 million calls a year in that, they're not too excited about that until we were able to tell them, if we deploy this and it works like we think it's going to work, we will save average handle time in the call centers by 20 seconds per member interaction. 20 seconds of average handle time in a call center equates to tens of millions of dollars per year, right, in cost. Now they're really interested. They're saying, what will it take to pilot that quickly, and we'll pay for it. So getting the customer involved early, getting them part of your advocacy team is critical. And the other thing I would say, your best friend should be minimal viable product, MVP. Because if you try to build the perfect whatever, it's going to take a long time to get there. You'll never get there. But MVP buys you some time, and it allows you to spiral develop along the way.
Yes, and football bat. So football bat, basically to me, is we have a lot of senior leaders here and mid-level managers as well. Encourage football bat ideas. And what I say by football bat is there's no such thing, right? It's bizarre, it's weird, there's other words for it. As leaders, you need to encourage football bat ideas. Let them create. You need to know the definition or the differences between transformation and modernization. And innovation. The football bat practice will get you to the innovation piece, because you'll think of some of the most bizarre, off-the-wall ideas, but you need to encourage that with your folks so that they won't be afraid to speak up, they won't be afraid to offer suggestions. Even if it's a bad one, maybe it's viable, maybe it'll produce something. So just encourage that throughout your units.
Terrific.
At the end of the day, we're going to be assessed as to whether or not we delivered collectively solutions to some very complex problems, not by whether any one of us individually was successful. And we can use that to drive toward collaboration, toward solving some of these really hard problems. And we should measure that. There was an excellent presentation yesterday that talked about the fact that on one of our major systems now, we're now getting data from ingest to in the hands of end users in 0.12 seconds. That's remarkable. That's amazing. And that's the sort of number that we can put in front of people that allows us to say, how do we draw that number down to 0.10 seconds? How to draw that down to 0.08 seconds? And we have those clear goals in place, and we're all driving toward these clear goals and clear numbers, and we can see them moving in one direction or another. I think that will drive us to collaborate toward excellence in solving some of these hard, complicated problems.
Terrific. And I have one ask of the audience, and that is to help me in thanking this panel, not just for being here today, but more importantly, for making sure that everything they're doing today and next week will make it so that when we look back from 2030, we say, gosh, look at how far we've come, and look at how much difference there is now in the way we're doing business and the way we're operating. So thank you very much for everything.
And ma'am, on behalf of the chapter, we'd just like to thank you and your panel for taking time today to be with us, share your insights and experiences, and especially for you for having done double duty for us this time around too, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich, for everything.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think unfortunately we have another disconnect in your pocket program. Please note that we will be beginning the next presentation at 11 o'clock right here in the auditorium here. In the meantime, please feel free to stretch your legs, visit the exhibit hall, grab some more espresso at the espresso bar, and we will see you back here at 11 o'clock for our next speaker, please. Thank you.